It's Fully Threaded Radio Special Report.
Hi, everyone. It's another special edition of Fully Threaded Radio. Lots of news with tariffs. This is breaking every day now, as it turns out. This is a conversation with brilliant Wisconsin-based Endries CEO Michael Knight. You've heard him on the podcast before, probably seen him at various shows and his many posts on LinkedIn. He's a person who has many insights and an excellent perspective to share with us here. So we'll dive right in. The title sponsors of Fully Threaded Radio are Brighton Best International, Global Fasteners, and Star Stainless. Fully Threaded is also sponsored by Buckeye Fasteners, BTM Manufacturing, Eurolink Fastener Supply Service, Fastener Technology International, InSequel Software, Fastener Fair USA, J-Land Franco, Solution Industries, Volt Industrial Plastics, and Worth Industry USA. Thanks so much for listening to Fully Threaded, everyone. If you've got tips or ideas for future episodes of the podcast, our email address is ftr@fullythreaded.com. We always appreciate the support. And as this is a very fluid situation, we recorded on April 4th, 2025. All right, here's this conversation with Michael Knight. Hi, Michael. Thanks for talking to me about tariffs. We've been talking offline, and we said, let's turn the recorder on.
Yeah, look out. And you know what's interesting, Eric, is now's the time to be talking about this, because I think that it won't be long before we are also just completely fatigued about this. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to listen about it. We don't want to think about it. But in the meantime, there's obviously a lot to unpack. But I think the big thing for me is how just comprehensively impactful this has been on the fastener industry in particular. And I think the fastener industry is, in fact, somewhat unique in terms of what we have to deal with, because obviously, so much of what we do is made out of steel. And so much of what's going on, at least at this point, centers around steel. And it's layers of tariff. This is related to Section 232, and it's not just on the Chinese anymore. Obviously, we lifted restrictions on 232 or exemptions. So now, pretty much, I think every country that we might import steel from or import something made out of steel now has a tariff on it. And then, of course, our northern neighbors who export a lot of steel into our domestic manufacturers for fasteners, they have a tariff on them. And now they've put a reciprocal tariff on the stuff that we make out of steel, among other things, and send back into Canada. So the net result is the fastener industry is already deeply impacted by this. In fact, the middle of March, I started getting hit with this on my imports. And it's not just the tariff, it's also all of the paperwork and everything else that comes with it. It's exponentially increased the amount of work that we have to do on our imports. I went through an example with a team earlier this week of the new paperwork requirements, data requirements. You have to now, they're expecting us to not just identify the country of origin, but where the metal was smelted, where it was poured. There's a whole bunch of new data points that customs wants that, of course, our suppliers aren't ready to supply. And in some cases, frankly, the data is proprietary. It's not something that a supplier would just voluntarily provide. And then, of course, us as importers, we have to figure out how we're going to receive the data, what we're going to do with it, how we're going to store it so that it can be easily accessed, because we don't know what we're going to get called upon to provide. And there's this notion out there that, let's say we're importing a bolt, and if the cost of that is 60% steel, that theoretically we'd only have to pay a tariff on the 60% instead of the 100% price that we're paying for that bolt. So customers have heard that, and they're saying, well, I don't want to, even if you're going to pass this thing through, I don't want to pay a tariff on 100% of your buy price. I want to pay it just on the steel. Well, we're nowhere near ready to do that. The suppliers even if they're willing to provide that data, aren't ready to do that. By the way, at the border, Customs isn't ready to handle that. And that's the problem. The big challenge with a lot of this is we're treating it like a light switch, and we make this proclamation. By we, I mean our federal government, that starting tomorrow, there's going to be a 25% tariff on all cars that come in. Well, there's a lot of stuff that has to go into place before we can actually implement that. We're expecting like 24-hour implementation on this stuff, and that's just not practical. So, kind of long story short here, the fastener industry is really up against this, and our customer base, understandably, they're confused, they're concerned. And it goes beyond just fasteners, because so many of our customers, what they're building involves a lot of metal, whether it's a generator or a snowblower. Obviously the housings of these things, there's a lot of metal involved. So they're having to deal with the tariff impact of that, et cetera, et cetera. So this has been, I've been at this, I've been working a long time, and in my entire career, I've never experienced anything even remotely this nutty.
Yeah, we were trying to schedule a meeting, and you were going through the calendar, and you pointed out, well, every Friday afternoon now is chewed up with the tariff meeting. That's how you end your week these days.
Yeah, and most mornings, that's how we start it, because it's changing so quickly. And fortunately, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but the first Trump administration forced us with the Section 301 tariffs against China to put some systemic things in place on how to do this in terms of a pass-through. Because my preference, frankly, is to handle the tariffs as a pass-through, because they are binary. So at the moment they're turned on, and it's a real cost impact to me that I have to deal with. But at some point in time, I have to believe they'll be turned off. So the faster that I can disconnect from the tariffs, because they're no longer a cost impact, and therefore decouple tariffs from my customer, the better, right? But that's the other part of this, Eric. And the big question that I think everybody is getting right now is how are we going to handle this? Because if you think about this for Endries business, I'm the importer of record for a lot. So I'm paying the tariff when I get the part in, and I know exactly what that tariff is. And so my preferred method of dealing with it, because by the way, it's too big for any of us to eat. And that's the other thing people are struggling to make peace with, is that, this immediate notion, right, that, well, the channel just is going to have to absorb this. And I don't know if you've been following the news about like what Walmart is doing, for instance. Walmart's basically telling their foreign suppliers, don't bother, we're not paying the tariff. You have to reduce your price to us accordingly. Well, and the Chinese suppliers in particular are saying, can't do it. Not happening. There's not enough margin in this business for us, with, in this particular instance, Walmart, for us to eat it. It's true in my business as well, especially if parts are coming out of China. The size of these tariffs mean that this is not just going to get absorbed. It's got to get passed through ultimately to the end customer, and that's very traumatic. So if you think again about our business, when they're importer record, I can do that very transparently. That's my preferred method of doing it. That said, not all customers can take, in essence, a tariff surcharge and line item on an invoice. So we're having to kind of work that out. But with that same customer, I may also be supplying parts where I'm not the importer of record, that the parts are imported. And in those instances, my cost on that part is going to have the tariff baked into the cost. It's my least favorite way, because it's a lot less transparent and it's a lot more difficult to strip it out. The second I get a cost reduction from my source, I can pass that, I can implement that with my end customer. But it's murky, and that doesn't happen as quickly as flipping the switch on the surcharge. And then the third instance is I'm sourcing something locally, but it too has had an impact on cost because of this Canadian steel surcharge, or rather tariff. I bet you know this better than I do. Uh, so many of our domestic suppliers of fasteners rely on Canadian steel, and some very heavily. So that shows up as a cost increase. And so I may be talking to customers about all three situations based on the basket of parts that I'm supporting them on. And so it's a ton of data. And the takeaway here is, at least for us, it's a very part number and customer specific solution's not the right word, kind of strategy on how to deal with this. And of course, we're not the only ones that's supplying parts that are affected by this to the customer. So the customer's having to do this on a much larger scale. And just to underline it, for the things that I'm an importer of record of, we've identified 110,000 part numbers that are now affected by tariffs. And of course,
Wow.
every morning we wake up, there's new tariffs and more part numbers.
Wow.
Right. So, yeah, you imagine the amount of data you have to chew through.
Incredible. Well, we're ensconced here in the fastener industry. So you were saying earlier, that it's hitting the fastener world, but it might not just be our imagination. I don't know if you caught it last week, front page of the business section of the Wall Street Journal. They had a headline, "Tariffs on screws are already hitting their manufacturing." Yeah. Jim Derry with Field Fastener was quoted in there, and he was pointing out exactly what you were saying. We're not paying it. Well, they're not paying it. Who's going to pay it? And I think ultimately there's going to be a lot of finger pointing. And can anyone say supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, and so if you move beyond just the tariff and you start looking at second and third order effects, I think you're right. What's going to end up happening, and we're already seeing it, right? As people scramble and try to reconfigure their supply chains, lead times are pushing out, container costs are going up. And on top of everything else, apparently we're now going to start charging at the port. I think it's $1.5 million if the ship was built by China and or is owned and operated by a Chinese company. And the math I saw on this, that adds another $200 or $300 of cost per container. And obviously the transportation costs for containers have been swinging pretty wildly through 2024 and gotten at points almost to the level they were during the worst of the supply chain crisis. So that's not good news, because again, it's pushing up the cost of freight. And oh, by the way, I thought this was really interesting. So the fact is that the Chinese now pretty much dominate the shipping manufacturing industry. I want to say, this is just off the top of my head, so I could be getting this wrong, but they make like 8,700 freighters a year, and we make domestically like 300, right? So if our objective in this is to get people to buy U.S. ships, well, how long is it going to take before we could scale up to actually offset Chinese supply? And therein lies a thing we're all wrestling with, which is trying to understand the objectives, which I'll just tell you, I think many of them are extremely important. I think what we're trying to accomplish here conceptually, it's tough, but it's really important. And as the president has said, it's not going to happen without some pain. But there's a level of realism about what it takes to implement this stuff that I'm confused about. I mean, there's no way that all this manufacturing is going to come back to the U.S. overnight. I mean, let's be honest. It's taken more than 50 years. Over the course of 50 years, it's shifted. And I want to talk for a minute about incentives versus tariffs, because I think that's relevant here.
Yeah, I saw your LinkedIn post on that subject, Michael, and I'd like you to talk on that. But I think you're hitting at a really great point right here. I'd like to stick on it for just a second before you move on to that. In that same article from Wall Street Journal, Gene Simmons of Semblex was making a similar point. He said the production capacity we need doesn't exist here in the U.S. to fill the gap. And so my question to you is, assuming that our intentions with all this or our objectives with these tariffs are, as you said, you got to face the piper eventually. Do you think that better communication would help this situation out? You think it's as simple as that? If we just understood what was happening, that it would remove some of the chaos?
It would help, but honestly, I think I have a pretty good handle on what's happening because I don't have a choice. I mean, I'm probably 3 or 4 hours of my day these days is related to tariffs and these second order effects. And Eric, here's the thing. I think if we all had a perfect understanding, we'd be scared shitless. Maybe I should say more scared shitless.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but you need the understanding in order to figure out how to navigate this. And I'll tell you right now, and I've said this out loud before too, is I don't see any safe harbors. And back on this point of how quickly it's going to take to reshore, well, the fact of the matter is, and I think this might have even been talked about in the same Wall Street Journal article, we're already tight on labor. So we bring all this manufacturing back. We don't have the people to support it just yet, and maybe ever. So that's a problem. There's also the matter of the expense of this, whether it's expanding, you're already here, it's expanding capacity, or you're not here and you're going to come in. I'll tell you, so we've been doing a lot of things in terms of new DCs. I've got a new DC I'm just set up down in Texas. I finished one about a year ago in the Chicago area. Just moving into an existing, it's already constructed building, moving an operation out of one area into a new building. That's a 6-month process. And if you got to build it, add another 18 months. So the math just doesn't, I don't understand the math. That this is something we're going to have to deal with. And then you add to that, and this will get me into what you were talking about, the difference between the carrot and stick approach. The issue with tariffs is that they can be flipped on and off very quickly, as we now have all seen. And if the tariff is the motivation to add capacity in the U.S., and that motivation could evaporate literally overnight, how willing are you to step up on a long-term capital commitment to add that capacity? And so my fear is that there's just a real reluctance to take action on this because there's uncertainty about how long the tariff is going to last, which gets me to what I think is probably the most important consideration here, which is the thing I like about incentives, whether they're it's a tax abatement. I mean, incentives can come in lots of different ways. Incentives tend to be passed into law, so they're more predictable, more dependable, and I think in the long run they enable companies to make these long-term kind of big bets more easily. And the fact of the matter is, it was the incentives that other countries, especially Asian countries, offered our U.S. manufacturing companies to relocate to Asia. This is back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that created that shift. So I think historically we have a perfect example of how effective incentives can be to move things, to reorganize the global supply chain, because that's what happened back then. That was a first massive restructuring of the global supply chain. And in a way, actually, it was, if you think about it, it was the start of the globalization of the supply chain. And it was all driven by incentives. Now, admittedly, that's a long time scale. I mean, you're talking, this has been ongoing now for over 50 years, but initially it was probably about 10 years before that really took hold. And I think one of the hallmarks of President Trump is he's action oriented and he's impatient. And actually, I share some of those traits, so I can understand that. And 10 years is, these days, that's a lifetime. And we don't have 10 years for that to happen. So here we are.
Well, appreciate your insights, Michael. It's always amazing to talk to you because you have great ones and you're always willing to share them. Let me wind up with this. And I don't want to put you on the hot seat here, but not to prognosticate, but where are you putting your money on this? How does it unfold?
Oh, wow. I think where I'm putting my money, frankly, is that this is going to be around for a long time. again, because some of the things we're trying to accomplish here are long overdue and really important. Like the semiconductor industry, for instance, that's strategically important to our future. Something different has to be to happen there. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to be buying made in the USA clothing or shoes anytime soon. I mean, that stuff just doesn't exist, and we all need clothing. So I tend to take the president at his word. I think if you go back in time, he's been very consistent about his feeling on trade and on tariffs in particular. And I think we all need to be prepared for this. This is how it's going to be for the rest of this year into next year until some progress has been made on these goals that he's set for these actions. So I'm fully buckled up, Eric.
Okay, we'll take that. I'll look forward to talking with you about it down the road then, and looks like we'll have some time to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Fully Threaded Radio is a production of Fasteners Clearinghouse.